Hey guys, welcome to Doctrinal Truths. This is part one of a multi-episode series dedicated to proving the historical and archaeological veracity of the Book of Mormon. So to start off, there are several reasons why I wanted to really start this series. Um, we've got a lot of channels, blogs, and various geographic models that claim to be representative of where the Book of Mormon kind of took place. Some claim it happened in North America, others claim it happened in South America, others claim it happened in various different parts of Mesoamerica, or what is now known as southern Mexico. Um, and frankly, I really just wanted to kind of settle this debate, and I personally believe that with all of the available evidence that is given to us in the Book of Mormon, we can really place the location down to one specific area within the real world. So um, that being said, I believe the evidence that I am about to present in the upcoming videos and in this video will convince you that there's really only one location that fits the Book of Mormon in pretty much all aspects. These episodes will go over my findings over the course of several years of my personal research, hours in the library, hours reading books, lots of time spent trying to discover where this influential book really happened. If we're gonna take it at face value that it's um, a genuine historical text. So I hope everyone can come to the same conclusion that I have, which is that the Book of Mormon is a legitimate historical text, that it really was translated because of these findings that I've made and the correspondences that exist with the real world. So let's get started. So to start off, I really wanted to present the man who indirectly kind of started me on this journey to begin with, and that is an anthropologist known as John Sorenson. The geographic model, the Book of Mormon model that I'm about to present to you, is commonly known as the Sorenson model, named after this man right here, John, who originally proposed it over 40 years ago. With something to note is that I have made several of my own modifications to this model that I'll kind of be covering briefly in this video, but more in depth later on. Um, but without him and his pioneering work, really, the Book of Mormon wouldn't be nearly as defensible as it is, to be honest. Uh, all scholars who attempt to place the Book of Mormon in their various geographic models, regardless of where that is, owe a large part of their research to him. To give a brief summary, basically, so he was born on April 8th, 1924. He began his career in archaeology, surveying sites in Tabasco, which is in Mexico along the Gulf Coast. And this was while he was pursuing a master's degree as part of the New World Archaeological Foundation. This is a ongoing organization that is currently run out of BYU, dedicated to understanding ancient history in Mesoamerica. He got a PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles. He began teaching at BYU in 1963 and soon after established its anthropology department. He also served as the editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies and has written over 200 books and articles related to Book of Mormon geography. Like I said earlier, he's a pioneer of the Mesoamerican Book of Mormon model, specifically what we call the Grijalva River model. Um, and he actually recently passed away on December 8th, 2021. So, uh, as I was saying, we really owe a large part of our research on Book of Mormon studies to him. Without him, none of this would exist. And yeah, I really just wanted to clear that up before we dive headfirst into the presentation. So, uh, first, I think there are several points that need to be made before we really begin. The first is the assumption that the viewer has already kind of heard about the Book of Mormon previously, and knows that its primary purpose is to testify of Jesus Christ and not to change, but to clarify the doctrines and teachings found in the Bible. That's a controversial statement, but anyone who's really read the Book of Mormon and studied it will know that its its primary purpose is to expound on and really make clear the doctrines laid out in the Bible, for clarity purposes. The second point is that this channel is primarily concerned with the New World location of the Book of Mormon, as Old World locations found in the book are generally widely agreed upon. However, as a bit of background to the information that I'm about to present in future slides, I'll quickly cover this topic of the Book of Mormon in the Old World. Um, so essentially, the Book of Mormon starts off with a righteous family in Jerusalem, led by a prophet named Lehi, who the Lord ultimately warns to flee due to Jerusalem's wickedness and its imminent destruction by the Babylonians around 598 BC. Um, Eventually, they make their way through modern day Saudi Arabia. You can see their path that was taken here, and eventually reach a coastal area called Bountiful. So, from Bountiful, they build a ship and were ultimately guided by the Lord to the New World. So shown here is their route that they took, um, and then you can kind of see where they took off. Uh, I also got a map of the oceanic currents. This is when they took off from their boat. It says that they were guided by the Lord, but the Lord obviously works in. Um, he's a God of order, and he likely would have used natural processes to carry their ship, and that would have likely involved oceanic currents. And one oceanic current would have taken them to Mesoamerica, so Central America right here. You can kind of see it, the arrows heading over in this direction. If they were to depart from this area, they would have continued across through here, probably through the Philippines and the islands around this area, and they would have likely landed in Central America. But um, it should be noted that several locations mentioned within the Book of Mormon have actually been pretty much verified archaeologically and geographically within the real world. This includes the Valley of Lemuel, that would have been in this area right here. Um, and it's now known as Wadi Taib al-Izm, which is it's pretty much the only area in this entire region that has consistent flowing water, which is what is described in the Book of Mormon. They then travel down through fertile areas of the land, which this area is pretty mountainous, but it receives generally more rainfall than the other regions of Saudi Arabia. And then they would have arrived at a place called what Nephi calls Nahom, which has been shown to archaeologically have existed at the time of Nephi and Lehi and his family. And it was actually called Nehem. It's important to note that ancient Hebrew didn't have vowels; they used consonants as their words. So the word that we discovered at this site is it's called NHM, which there are various interpretations for that, but the Book of Mormon calls it Nahom. This map calls it Nehem, and from there they would have taken off eastward towards modern day Salalah, which is a town located in Wadi Saik, which is this very pretty much the only fertile area with sufficient lumber to build a boat in all of Saudi Arabia. That's in this area. So um, here's a link to Book of Mormon Central. They did an excellent video on this and kind of go over more detail this journey that Nephi, Lehi, and his family made from Jerusalem, and really shows some internal consistencies, both archaeologically and geographically, uh, within the Old World for locations mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So go check that out. And before we really get into the specifics, it's important to understand the general layout of the geography of the Book of Mormon in the New World. The next few slides cover what I believe are the most important features in developing an internal map consistent with the text. I think it should be understood that a lot of descriptions mentioned in the book are up for interpretation, but I do think that there is a correct interpretation to be made for each of these points. So first, the book mentions that there is a land northward and a land southward. The land northward contained an older civilization known as the Jaredites. If we go back to this, if we go back a slide to the previous slide, you'd have seen a yellow line on the Google Earth map. That would have likely been the route that the Jaredites took to the New World, but they would have landed likely somewhere along the east coast. Um, and eventually another group known as the Mulekites, who also fled from Jerusalem. Mulek was the son of King Zedekiah, who was obviously captured and killed along with the rest of his family when Jerusalem was sieged by the Babylonians. They also fled and landed in the New World, and they actually eventually integrated with the Nephite civilization in the land of Zarahemla. Um, and with that being said, the land southward contained the land of Zarahemla, which was founded by the Mulekites. Ignore the misspelling right there, but and it also contained the land of Nephi, which originally contained the Nephites, but the Nephites were forced to flee as it was taken over by the Lamanites, and they fled to the land of Zarahemla, where they kind of reunited with the Mulekites. Um, Now, the text mentions that the entire area was surrounded by water. The land northward, the land southward were surrounded by water, with there being a narrow neck of land, so an isthmus, in between both lands. This implies that the isthmus was also surrounded by water. Some some models try to interpret the narrow neck of land as a pass with water on one side and a sort of geographic feature on the other side. But I think the text makes it pretty clear that it is an isthmus, and it basically separated the land northward from the land southward. Now there was also a narrow pass or a narrow passage that was pretty much the only area you could go through to travel back and forth between the land northward and the land southward. Some people, well, most people interpret this as being a mountain pass, but truthfully, that could be anything. It could be a land bridge, it could be a mountain pass, anything that really provides passage, uh, sort of travel between two areas. Um, so there was a narrow pass in between the land northward and the land southward. And then there was also a defensive line within the narrow neck that led from the east, an undefined point on the east, to the West Sea, and it was a 1 to 1.5 day journey on that line. Now, it's important to understand that this 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 defensive line didn't cover the entire portion of the narrow neck. So the narrow neck of land wasn't the isthmus itself wasn't a 1 to 1.5 days journey all the way across. We don't actually know uh, how much distance was within the narrow neck of land, but we do know that within the narrow neck of land there was an undefined point on the east that led to the West Sea, and along that line was a 1 to 1.5 days journey. Um, so another important point for the internal map of the Book of Mormon that we have to take into consideration is that there was a sea east and a sea west. This kind of makes sense given what I explained earlier. Both the land northward and the land southward, they were surrounded by water. Um, Now, a sea north and a sea south are mentioned in the text, but it's only in a conceptual context. They're never actually mentioned with any associated activity, no travels. No one actually goes to or from or does anything around the North or South Sea, and it's never associated with any specific activity. So, unlike the East and the West Sea, um, which both are associated with travels, various journeys within the Book of Mormon, the North and the South Sea are only mentioned in a conceptual context to kind of uh, give a understanding to the reader of the situation and the positioning of the people within the New World. Um, there was also a major river that ran through the land of Zarahemla. This is called the River Sidon. Its headwaters were in the mountains, so likely in the narrow strip of wilderness that we'll cover later. Um, it's indicated that it flows northward. There are cities on either side on the east and on the west of the river. Um, and it flows out to the sea, probably the East Sea. This is indicated by the fact that there are a significant amount of Nephite cities and activity along the East Coast. You can kind of see that here. Um, there's also the city of Zarahemla. That was northward of the land of Nephi by about a 21-day journey through mountain wilderness. Um, it should be noted that this 21-day journey was taken by a large group of people that included men, women, children, likely elderly, possibly the sick, um, which meant they wouldn't have been traveling, and it was over mountain wilderness, which would have meant that they probably wouldn't have been traveling any more than at most 13 to 14 miles. It was likely a 9 to 14 mile per day journey. Um, and we'll kind of be going into that a little bit later. But uh, Nephi is also said to be surrounded by wilderness. It's also said to be in the center of the land, probably a narrow inland river valley. The cities mentioned to the east and west of it are no more than a day's journey. Um, and so this kind of gives the idea that it was pretty condensed within a specific area. And the city was also located directly west of the Riverside. So the next important point is the city of Nephi. City of Nephi is the first major city that was established in the New World by the Nephites. So when Nephi and his family landed, Nephi fled from his brothers who were antagonistic towards him and went up into the highlands and founded a city called the City of Nephi. The City of Nephi is mentioned as consistently being up in elevation from Zarahemla. It's situated in a mountain valley uh, because on the periphery of the city, you actually go down to the city of Zarahemla. So it's mentioned in the book that when travelers kind of get into the vicinity of the city, they go down into the city of Nephi. But it was situated in mountain highlands. Um, it was also the heart of Lamanite territory. It was the main city of the Lamanites. Um, the Nephites did live there for about 4 centuries, but by about 200 BC is when they had to flee due to persecution from the Lamanites as they kind of took over the area. Um, Now, the next important location or feature is the narrow strip of wilderness. This was a natural defensive line between Nephi and Zarahemla, and it's mentioned as having stretched from the East Sea over here all the way to the West Sea. This defensive line didn't necessarily have to be mountainous the entire way. Um, it very likely could have been a cultural / linguistic boundary, um, or it could have been partly covered by a water feature such as a river. But part of it definitely was covered by mountain wilderness, as is kind of common sense when it talks about travels between the land Nephi and the land of Zarahemla. So The third point that should be taken note of is the land of Bountiful. So this was the land between the land of Nephi or the land of Zarahemla rather, and the land Desolation. It was northward of Zarahemla. It also contained a city that was near the narrow pass to guard the route to the land northward. It was about a 4 to 5 days travel from the coastal city of Moroni. You can kind of see it here. Um, and it was also likely near the East Sea due to the uh, due to the various travel times and journeys made by um, Captain Moroni and his military expeditions against the Lamanites. Um, and I'll kind of be going into that a little bit more in depth later on. But um, the fourth, uh, another feature is the hill Cumorah, the land Cumorah. That was located pretty much at the most northern point of the land, and it was situated near the East Sea. It was probably located in a small mountain chain. It's mentioned that there was another prominent hill near it called the Hill Shim, and it was probably also surrounded. It was probably pretty pretty much by itself, to be honest. It was probably surrounded by coastal plains. It was probably pretty prominent. Armies were able to gather around the hill. When you climbed the hill, you were able to get a very good view of the surrounding area. So a few books have been written on the basically the top 10 requirements needed for the hill Cumorah, and that's and I recommend you all go and look into that a little bit. But that's kind of these are kind of the most important points about the hill itself in the Book of Mormon. This is also where the plates were buried by Moroni before he took off and fled from the Lamanites after his people went extinct and were killed off. So when all this is taken into consideration, there's really only one location that fits the Book of Mormon's descriptions in pretty much all aspects. When you place it down to in the real world, this is what the map looks like. Um, it's important to note that all of these sites shown on the map match up with a real world location, a real world ancient city at the right time. Uh, and this is something that we will be covering in future episodes. Everyone should stay tuned for those. I've got a lot of cool research coming out, and yeah, these all of these sites match up with known archaeological sites that date to the right time. Obviously, none of these are exact. Not all of these are exact locations. Some of them are up for change as new archaeological discoveries are being made. Um, but as time goes on, they'll kind of sort themselves out and position themselves where they need to be. But for the most part, this is how the layout of the land looks in the real world. For reference, this is southern Mexico. This is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec right here. This is the Grijalva River. Nowadays, it actually drains more east in a more easterly direction this way. But back then, its headwaters actually, or its drainage actually ended up farther to the west. So that's probably how it would have looked back then. Um, Now, there are several considerations that we need to make before we really dive into the specific geographic features of this map. So, the first is because the Book of Mormon is an authentic ancient text, the directional system, and because it's a translated text, the directional system likely would have been different from our modern interpretations and our modern understanding of directions. Um, Most ancient cultures had their own way of conceptualizing the world. Um, For example, the Egyptians, they used the flow of a river. They oriented themselves based on the flow of rivers. The Egyptian word and conception of north actually essentially meant downriver or with the flow of the river. And the conception of south was upriver or against the flow of the river. This is because they oriented themselves based on the Nile River, and as we know, that flows from south to north and drains into the Mediterranean. But it's actually interesting because similarly, the Grijalva River also flows in this direction, and the Egyptians, anything on the east, anything to the east or to the left of the river was considered the west, and anything on the right was considered the east. From what my research indicates. Now, if you orient yourself in that direction based on the flow of a river, this is likely how the map would have looked to Mormon. You saw that map earlier, the internal map that was on the slide. This is probably how he would have oriented himself based on Egyptian directions. Now, I think it's important to understand that this is a real possibility. You know, the Nephites were known to have written in a script known as Reformed Egyptian. So that easily could have carried over into the translational process and made it to what we now have in the text. Interestingly, the Mayans also used a different set of directions. They actually had 5 directions. So they had north, south, east, and west, and then they also had center. So to give an idea of what that means, essentially the center was where the individual was standing at that time. That was considered a specific direction. And they actually used the sunset and the sunrise to determine directions. So, for example, anywhere they could see the sun set was the west. Anywhere they could see the sun rise was the east. And that kind of would have resulted in what we see here, which is this X shape. Now, if you apply that to a map, you actually get an interesting correlation with the Book of Mormon if we are assuming that this is where it happened. So say, for example, you're situated in Bountiful, and you're watching the sun set to the east. This would have meant anything in that direction is the east, and you can see why they would have called that the EC. I don't have a specific source for this, but I believe I read in a book somewhere. I can't remember what it was. Don't quote me on this, but I believe that this area actually was considered to be the east by the ancient peoples that lived in this area. Now, if you were situated in the land of Nephi, anything over here would have been east, and as you can see, there's an EC. So basically, all this goes to say that directional systems back then were different. As an ancient text, these likely would have made it through the translational process and carried over into what we now have in the Book of Mormon. Now, there were directions that are similar to ours. We have the land northward and the land southward. But I think it's interesting that when you do orient yourself in these ancient directions, that you still have that those features listed. Now, the second consideration to make is that the distance of the narrow neck, the isthmus, was never actually specified. Now, we have several points within the Book of Mormon that give an idea of how large the isthmus may have been. And from what we can tell, it was probably a decent distance across. We know that there was a defensive line located within the isthmus that was about a 1 to 1.5 days journey. A lot of modelers misread the text and interpret this to mean that was the entire length of the isthmus, But that's not actually what the text says. It says from the east to the West Sea was about a 1 to 1.5 days journey. Now, what that eastern point was, we don't really know. If we are using these maps, the modern maps, it likely would have been probably this mountain range right here, um, or some other geographic feature that impeded travel to the east. And then from that direction to the West Sea was fortified by the Nephites. It's also interesting in the Book of Mormon. We at one point we uh, read about a expedition known as the Limhite expedition, who was trying to find the Nephites in the land of Zarahemla from the land of Nephi. But they end up getting lost, and they end up all the way in the land northward, and they never actually realized that they passed through the isthmus itself. So the isthmus was obviously large enough that you could pass through it without really understanding that you went through it. So based on all of these ideas, what we kind of have inferred from the text, it's probable that the isthmus was anywhere from 100 to 120 miles across. I think a lot of modelers try to exacerbate this distance with the Isthmus of Tehuantepec by saying it's 140 miles, because that is the distance from this little peninsula that comes out. Little, you can kind of see right here, it juts out a little bit to the EC. But in reality, they wouldn't have included that in their distance. They would have just included wherever the water first meets the shore, which is this little inlet in here, this little laguna in this area. So it was about 120 miles across. It's also important to understand that the descriptions of these geographical features were made by a military commander. So Mormon, he was the one who composed the text. That's why it's called the Book of Mormon. But he likely viewed, as a military commander, he likely viewed the area from a bird's eye view. He knew where the points were, he knew the distances, he knew the geographic features, and he would have had it all mapped out. This is how he would have viewed the area. So, for all he was concerned with, there in fact was a smaller portion of land that separated the land northward and the land southward. That was a decent distance across, but definitely thinner than any other point across in the land northward and the land southward. This bird's eye view that he had would have resulted in the images we have here. As I mentioned before, each of these cities actually matches with the known archaeological site dated to the right time. They were abandoned at the right time. They were founded at the right times. And we'll be going over each of these cities in detail in future episodes. Now, the next point, the next consideration I wanted to make is this is a very nuanced consideration that you really have to understand and make some inferences as you're reading the text. So the Book of Mormon essentially mentions indirectly that the East Coast could not have been more than 80 to 100 miles long, and I'm going to explain how exactly. And that obviously, by the way, would have been much longer than the West Coast, given the fact that the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were probably about 210 miles between, which meant that the West, that leaves some discrepancies, and that means that the West Coast, or at least one of the coastlines, would have had to have been longer than the other. So we know that to kind of explain this, we know that the city Bountiful was within a day's travel to the city of Mulek, which is down here. It's kind of hard to see, but if you go back to an earlier part of the video, you'll be able to see the larger map that I had in the previous slides. But we know that the city Bountiful was within a day's travel to the city of Mulek, as evidenced by the fact that One of the Nephite commanders at the time was able to take Mulek back from the Lamanites, starting from Bountiful in the period of 1 day. And that's talked about in Alma 52. Now, immediately afterwards, within one operation, the Nephites were then able to take the city of Gid, which implies that it was close to the city of Bountiful. Now, for the rest of the cities, I'm gonna actually cover uh, some points made by John Sorenson himself. He actually explains these features a lot better than I ever could, and this is found in his book titled An Ancient American Setting. This was a monumental book that he wrote that basically became the foundation for all modern geographic models that place the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica. But he says, he goes on to state, this is page 17, he says, the Nephite commander Moroni set up a string of garrison cities on the east coast against an anticipated Lamanite assault aimed at Bountiful and the strategic neck zone, so the narrow neck of land. The area soon became a crucial battle zone when the Nephite dissenter Amalickiah schemed his way into control of the Lamanite armies and blitzed along the coast, capturing city after city until he was at the border of the land Bountiful. As I mentioned, Bountiful was the city farthest north on the line of the march toward the land northward. At that point, one band of Nephite soldiers lured the Lamanite garrison out of their stronghold of Mulek, leading them off toward Bountiful, while a second force slipped around in the enemy rear to take possession of Mulek. Mulek and Bountiful were close enough together that Teancum's force could go a major part of the distance and back during part of one hot day, although it involved significant effort. On the basis of these statements, we can infer that it was about a regular day's march for soldiers from Mulek to Bountiful. This could have been anywhere from 15 to 20, 25 miles. A little later, the city Gid, which was located next to Mulek, was recaptured by the Nephites in a single operation. After more skirmishing, 4 named cities remained in Lamanite control, and that was, as you can see here, Morianton, Lehi, Nephihah, and Moroni. Now, in one climactic day of battle, the Nephites drove the enemy out of all of them, and that's mentioned in Alma 62, verses 24 through 35. The Nephite counterattack began probably at dawn against Nephihah, which was probably closer to the mountains, but still near the East Sea. And after they captured it quickly, Captain Moroni's army pursued the retreating Lamanites through Lehi and Morianton to the beach. And that's mentioned in verse 32. Along the shore, they then dashed to Moroni and arrived at the city at dark in verse 35. The day was spent mainly chasing the routed Lamanites and not fighting with them, so that pretty much the entire day was just chasing Lamanites. They wouldn't have really been involved in any battles. They might have had some skirmishes, but from what we understand and what the text tells us, the Nephites were essentially just driving them out city by city. Sorenson goes on to say, with adrenaline flowing, the armies might have gone 3 miles or more per hour for 15 hours, and this would have resulted in about 50 miles. It's important to understand, and this isn't anything John mentioned in his book, but distances and travel times varied significantly based on various factors, including geographic features and who was traveling at the time, whether or not the individual is being chased or is doing chasing. Now, in the war chapters in Alma, which is what we are currently discussing, we have to assume that Moroni and his armies were traveling relatively quick as they were trying to chase out all of the Lamanites within each of these cities as quick as possible. And eventually they would have landed in the city of Moroni. Now, this entire area is much less mountainous than the city of, or the area between Nephi and Zarahemla. This was a coastal plain. There weren't any mountains. There were swamps, but it was likely a much easier travel route in this area than was between Nephi and Zarahemla. Which means anyone traveling from Nephi to Zarahemla would have likely been traveling anywhere from 9 to 14 miles per day, a common travel time for groups of people in mountainous terrain. Whereas on the coast, where it was much flatter, and there were armies traveling instead of groups of people, civilians, they could have traveled up to 40 to 50 miles a day. The discrepancy is large, but it's because there is a significant number of differences in between the various journeys. So Sorensen goes on to say the route we can tell from the other evidence about the location of these cities was more of a semicircle than a straight line. You can kind of see that semicircle here. Interestingly, uh, the cities, the ancient archaeological sites slash cities that were in this area also form a semicircle and end up in Moroni. Uh, Sorensen goes on to say our conclusion must be that the piece of coastline involved that day could not have been more than 30 miles long. All these figures combined tell us something important about the length of the Nephite held east coast. Bountiful to Mulek we saw was about 20 to 25 miles. At the other extremity, the Nephiha Moroni sector accounts for perhaps 30 or more. That leaves the middle in which uh, the only named cities were Gid, Omn, and Omner. And lacking data on that section, I simply add another 30 miles by analogy with the other sectors. In summation, the distance from Bountiful on the north end to Moroni on the southern extreme of the east coast could not plausibly extend more than 85 miles. And then Sorensen goes on to kind of say that the east coast of distance of 85 miles or so was far shorter than the length of the land southward measured from Zarahemla to Nephi, and the land northward between the land southward, which was probably on the order of around 350 miles. So all of that goes to say that the East Sea coast was probably much shorter than the Sea West coast. Um, I think it's important that uh, modelers understand this because a lot of the time when cities are placed along here, along the Caribbean Sea, the distance is actually much greater. It's a lot of the time they'll place it all the way up into the Yucatan or a little bit south of that, and it doesn't really accurately depict what is described in the text. Um, Now, the final consideration that should be made is the narrow strip of wilderness doesn't necessarily need to be a straight line from the East Sea to the West Sea, only from the East Sea to the West. The only time a straight line is mentioned is from the East Sea to the West, and that probably would have resulted. This is a map right here done by archaeologist John Clark. He did his own uh, internal model where he analyzed all of the geographic features of the Book of Mormon and plotted them on a map. Um, and that would have resulted in the straight line being mentioned. Like I said, that could be anything from a river to just a linguistic boundary. What we do have is the Usumacinta River here, which kind of goes in a semicircle and goes up into the highlands. It's kind of hard to read this here. I'll read this for you, but this is a map from a report done by the New World Archaeological Foundation, um, explaining the linguistic territory between the Miches Sokes, which were the quote unquote civilization at the time in this area, and the Mayans, which were in this area. And it says, let me pull that up real quick. It says, map showing a distribution of major culture areas in Mesoamerica as related to Asapa, which was an archaeological site down here, and a highly idealized zone of Miche-Soke Maya interaction in preclassic times, which preclassic times were Book of Mormon times. It says the zone of interaction may have curved closer to the Usumacinta River and its tributaries. So it wouldn't have probably been a straight line like this. It would have curved basically what we see in this map. Um, and that probably would have resulted in what we now know as the narrow strip of wilderness. It also is mentioned in the text to have had some curve as it talks about going roundabout the borders of the wilderness. Um, so those are all the major considerations that I think we really need to keep in mind as we're trying to plot down where the book happened. Uh, Before I move on, it's also important to note that most of these features are already covered by John Sorenson in his previous books. I am just purely with my own, obviously, with my own interpretations and my own insertions, uh, trying to explain them to you guys. So, um, moving on, why southern Mexico, right? We have a good map, right? Um, we have proper locations. Um, any discrepancies have been explained, but there are dozens of areas with similar features and orientations and with a narrow neck and various other geographical attributes that could easily also fit these what the Book of Mormon says about geography. So why southern Mexico? Well, for one, it was the only location in the Western Hemisphere known to be highly literate from Jaredite to Nephite times. Um, so for a extremely long period of time, which is also what the Book of Mormon says, there were large literate civilizations for thousands of years. We don't have that anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere. We have various different kinds of forms of communication, but we don't have writing and reading anywhere else. Um, some people in the what is known as the heartland of the United States who claim that the Hopewell culture groups were the Nephites. They tried to justify various, essentially frankly would have been proven to be frauds, artifacts with writing on them as evidence that they were literate. But as I said, pretty much all of these were found in contexts that were intrusive and uh, not contemporaneous. So no archaeologist will, at least no credible archaeologist will claim that anywhere else in the New World had writing and reading at the time of the Nephites, apart from Mesoamerica, southern Mexico. Um, so, kind of going along with that, large populations with state level civilization capable of commanding armies and building large cities and roads only existed in southern Mexico at the time of the Book of Mormon. This is exactly what's described in the book itself. Both the Nephites and the Lamanites and the Jaredites, frankly, were massive state level civilizations, and that's exactly what we get in the Book of Mormon, or in southern Mexico rather. It's the only area with geological activity capable of causing the destructions mentioned in 3rd Nephi. This includes volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. Um, I think it's important to note that, as I said before, the Lord works in natural ways. He's going to work in in scientific ways. He doesn't do things that are that are magical, quote unquote. I mean, all things are possible through the Lord, but um, he's likely going to use natural phenomena to accomplish his means. And in the Book of Mormon, we can see a wide variety of descriptions that match natural events, such as eruptions and earthquakes and hurricanes and other um, natural weather phenomena. So um, southern Mexico, Mesoamerica, really the only area that can account for these destructions. I suggest everyone go and read those accounts in 3rd Nephi to kind of get an idea. We'll cover this later in more detail, but to kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, we also see the rise and fall of various civilizations, the Olmec, the Maya. While uh, we don't really call the Nephites, or we won't say the Nephites are the Maya, they likely participated in the culture itself. And the Olmec, while they weren't the Jaredites likely participated in Olmec culture. So But what's interesting is we see that the rise and fall of these civilizations occurred at the same time as those mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So the Nephites died out at around the same time that we see a large collapse in the Mesoamerican area around uh, the start of the early classic period, what is what archaeologists call it, which is around 300 to 400 AD. And then the Olmec died off or disappeared around 500 to 400 BC, which also matches with Jaredite chronology. We also see the use of several Mesoamericanisms throughout the text. This includes the burial of weapons in ritual context, as we saw with the anti-Nephi Lehis. That was a common occurrence in Mesoamerica. We see human sacrifice, especially done by the Lamanites in the final war. Possible Mesoamerican calendrical systems, which is, we'll kind of go over that a little bit later, but we see the use of several Mesoamerican calendar ideas within the Book of Mormon prophecies themselves. And we also see fighting wars during specific seasons. Interestingly, and this is work that has been done by other scholars, but we do see a consistent pattern in which wars are fought around January in the Book of Mormon, from what I understand. We also see evidence of, as I was saying here, large-scale warfare at the appropriate time periods during the around 100 BC to 100 AD time period. We see large-scale conflicts around southern Mexico. We also see conflict around 300 to 400 AD. We know that the Olmecs likely engaged in warfare based off of iconography and various sculptures that they made. So we do have warfare around the appropriate time periods. Now it's important to note that these weren't just small raids. It wasn't just like various tribes going at it against each other, as we saw with the Hopewell, for example, in North America. These were massive, well-organized armies who were trying to essentially make the other go extinct. We see a very well-organized military system in Mesoamerica, which is interesting because this wasn't something that was actually taken seriously until probably the last 50 years, especially during Joseph Smith's time and later on. From what they understood about the early Mayan peoples and the early people in Mesoamerica, they considered, or at least they thought, that they were a peaceful people. But now we know through archaeological evidence that this was actually not true at all. And then the last thing is we see the movement of large groups of people at proper time periods. So we see pottery entering specific areas at specific times. We see people moving, evidence of people moving into the areas at the right times and in the right areas. So this is all important to consider when placing the Book of Mormon down. And I think that it really just goes to show that southern Mexico, Mesoamerica, is the only area in the New World, alongside the geographic features, that possibly fits the what the text describes in the Book of Mormon. So why the Sorenson model? We got the specific location down, or the general location down. Now we get into specifics. Why the Sorenson model? We see lots of different models throughout Mesoamerica. You have what's called the Rio Pasión model, which is a river that is right here. We have Usumacinta river models, which the Usumacinta, as I mentioned before, goes over here. Why the Sorenson model? Well, for one, it's the only Mesoamerican model with a city Nephi at a proper travel distance from the land of Nephi. When we put down the city of Nephi at the archaeological site known as Santa Rosa, I wrote a Wikipedia article on this city. You can all check it out by searching Santa Rosa Mesoamerican site on Wikipedia. But I'll be covering that in a future episode. But when we place that Zarahemla at that site, which matches extremely well with Zarahemla, and we place Nephi down here at a site called Kaminalhuyu, which I will also be going over later, and also matches up extraordinarily well with what we know about the city of Nephi. The distance is about 210 miles at a travel time of 9 to 14 miles per day in the wilderness, which anciently and even in modern times, when we see large groups of people, of civilians, men, women, and children traveling together in the wilderness, in mountainous, difficult terrain, which is what is described between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla, they are not traveling any more than 14 miles per day. In fact, most of the time they're traveling 9 to 10 miles per day max, sometimes even less. So when you take that into consideration, the Sorenson model is really the only area where distances match up from Zarahemla to Nephi. It's also the primary Mesoamerican model with an isthmus as the narrow neck of land. Sorenson was pretty much the first to make this, to pioneer this idea. There were mentions of it before, but he was really the first to kind of give it a platform as the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, as the isthmus mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Other models try to make the isthmus the narrow neck of land, but it really started with Sorenson, and it really works the best with his model, in my opinion. It also has a northward flowing river into the East Sea. We do see that with other rivers, but the Grijalva River did flow in a northward direction. It's the only Mesoamerican model in which all Book of Mormon cities with described geological events are plausible. We've got the earthquake at Ammonihah, any sites that are proposed as Ammonihah. If you use the Isumacinta River as the river Sidon or any of these lowland areas, the river or the city of Ammonihah really doesn't match up in any like fault lines, you could say, where an earthquake would happen. This is, for context, this is when Alma and Amulek are imprisoned in the city because of their preaching against idolatry and wickedness. We also have volcanic eruptions that occur all throughout this region at the right time. It's likely that any volcanic eruptions, all the volcanoes were in this area, and any of the eruptions wouldn't have had as great a impact if you place Zarahemla and other cities up in this region as they would if you were to place them down here. We know from archaeological evidence that many cities in this area were destroyed around the time of Christ. We don't have any of that up here in the lowlands where other models are placed. Zarahemla was also, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, Zarahemla was also tightly surrounded by wilderness on its east and its west to provide a sense of what's quoted in the book as a sense of geographic security. You can see the scriptural references for that here, but if you're to place the city of Zarahemla or the land of Zarahemla in the lowlands here, you have a pretty wide gap between the eastern mountains in Belize here and the mountains in Chiapas here. Certainly not a very narrow or tight wilderness valley area. And we know that it was, in addition to, it being described as secure, we know that it was probably pretty narrow due to the distances between these cities on the east and on the west within the land of Zarahemla, near the borders of the wilderness. And then lastly, as I mentioned with the East Coast cities, the East Coast in the Sorenson model is the required length as implied in the Book of Mormon. So likely no longer than a day's travel by forced military march between these cities. which would have been around probably 40 to 50 miles from the city of Moroni to the city of Omner, which is right here next to Mulek. So that's it. That covers this presentation. I just wanted to thank all of you guys for bearing with me to the end of the video. This is kind of new for me. I'm just getting started with YouTube. This is the first video I've ever made. So thank you for kind of putting up with any technological deficiencies that I might have had. I'm kind of starting new, so but these are all the sources that I used and recommended readings. If you are interested in any additional research that you plan on doing outside of this video, I know this is a lot of information, but trust me, there's a lot more to come in the future. I will be scientifically picking apart the Book of Mormon over the course of this series until essentially it can't be taken, it can't be anything but taken seriously as a legitimate historical text. I hope that you guys like this video, subscribe, share it with your friends and your family. You definitely don't want to miss the upcoming presentations that I have planned for you all. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye.